Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
The second topic for the second module is all about discussing the available literary resources that we count on to track the timeline as well as to understand the importance of this habitual practice that's spreaded all over in our country. To realize that, we must also consider these three basic different aspects that operates the fiber of all art practices. If we consider these three as the thread, temple and court, that mostly epitomize the three constituents that constantly endorse, advocate and influence the cultural spectrum and the aesthetic range of Indian art practice. Since its formative years, folk paintings have been associated with the temple tradition by laying its foundation on impermanent grounds. The artworks were mostly ephemeral in their characteristic, unlike the painting that are commissioned by the court, by the rulers, that considered some kind of a permanence. They considered the longevity. They wanted that to stay almost forever. Whereas for folk painting, it was perhaps the legacy that they wanted to get continued and become permanent. So it was more like a knowledge that is quite tacit in nature, that had to be preserved and passed on through generations. So the entire thing followed a very different principle altogether. The court paintings were done under royal patronage, whereas the folk painters hardly enjoyed any patronage from a resourceful section of the community. As murals on the wall or ceilings of the shrines, temples, whereas folk paintings were made on the backdrop screens of the popular temples, and they used to be taken out from time to time for the common people to proliferate the divine messages. The paintings were made as souvenirs to be brought and taken away by the pilgrims often. The formats were to support the purpose of the portability in the form of wall hangings or rolled up painted scrolls. So every time we see that when they stick it with a wooden stick or some kind of a stick and roll it up, and then the entire thing is very easy to carry. So we can either carry it by buying them, taking it back home, by packing them very conveniently, or it's more like you get the thing and then unfold and then it takes a massive size. So that was a wonder factor. It was also true that the story used to get unfolded in sequence, and that made it so fascinating, so interesting, because it had a linear formation. It still has. And that linear formation doesn't let you go to the end and see the story, and that way the non-linearity was not there ever. Although the stories were based on the key frames, the narratives were much more continuous, and the stories were based on the basic key frames which used to be picked up very decisively. For example, when it's a known story like Ramayana, which is almost known by everybody, there the artist need not to pick up too many frames. The artist could afford to skip quite a few frames and only show the key frames which are very important, and the audience can easily connect those stories with their own knowledge. Whereas if there's a new story, we saw that the artist is incorporating many more frames to depict that. But there had been fixed rules, fixed formations of those things. So the paintings were made solely for common viewing and devoid of any political persuasions of any kind. They were not to be preserved for ages but meant to be recreated perennially. They were not meant for one-sided viewing, rather they wanted their audiences to perceive it, and that way it was more like a performance where music, dance movements, some bit of an acting, the scripts with conversations, and also the tune, the other songs, lyrics, as well as the visual compositions, colors, lines, everything blended together, and they all together made the thing very, very happening for the people, and it was more like a mode of a very effective communication. That was the only mode of entertainment, enrichment, and whatever we call it. So, if we go back to the early literary sources, we see the history of the origin of Pattachitra from partial and authentic sources, and common saying claim that the painted scrolls have been widely used for the purpose of social reformation to educate and morally train the common people. Literature levels that during to the time of Buddha, there had been communities titled as Maskari or the Mashkari, who were appointed for such tasks. Abhigyan Shakuntalam and Malavikagnimitram by the great poet Kalidasa from the 5th century, having mentioning of Pattachitra as a practice and viewing in them. Vanabhatta's Harshacharit from 7th century and Bishakadatta's Mudra Rakshasa from 8th century mention existence of Yamapatta that proves the ancientness of this tradition. In Mudra Rakshasa, it is mentioned that the Mashkari community used to demonstrate painted scrolls against alms for the common household. In the narration, the paintings they showed how to messengers of the Yama, the god of death, or in other sense, some of the Pattachitrakars they say that Yama is not the god of death, that how he is commonly recognized by people, but he is rather the god of forgiveness. So there are still chances one can do something good to cover the person's evil scenes, and then they may achieve some kind of a forgiveness from that particular deity. So most of the time we see that in the narration the paintings they showed that had the god of forgiveness or death destined sinners to punishment for their misdeeds. Even now the Pattachitrakars of Bengal region often conclude their religious demonstrations with the unavoidable end episode of after death conditions that embodies the court of Yama, the god of death, and the ultimate sentence. And after death, they show the situations where the dead person achieves a new life, where they pass through different stages before they reach Yama. And in each stages, they are asked to perform certain things to do some kind of a cleansing, and the cleansing is only possible if the amount of sin is minimum. So the more we can avoid sin, the more we can avoid interaction with Yama, and then the people can straight away reach heaven. So these are the motivations that was there behind telling all those stories, that inserted the moral characteristics, the moral lessons to its audiences to a large extent. In Vikrampur, Dhaka, capital of Bangladesh, they call this kind of demonstration as Pater Nachano. That means which is like make a painted scroll dance to emphasize upon its performance aspect. Ancient text Shukranitishar indicates many forms of pratima that are cult images of mother goddesses. Pratima Saikati Paishyasti Lekhya Lepyan Mrinmayi Vaksi Pashanadhatutha Stiragneya Yatottara. The text categorically mentions lekhya, which were to be painted as two-dimensional pictures for worshipping. Further, painted and rolled up narrative scrolls attached to the wooden sticks find mentionings in Chandimangala Kavya. The Christian missionaries during 1st and 2nd century AD used papyrus for the same purpose. Those paintings are kept in Vatican till date. The cave paintings of Ajanta also have some stylistic reminiscence from the 1st and 2nd century BCE. What we get to see in the 5th century BCE, depicting stories from Jataka, that is the story of the past lives of Buddha, that display the similar formation of continuous narration. Sachi Stupa complex has combination of miniature carvings as stone relief sculptures on its narrative panels, and that gives us some kind of an impression that telling story through images had been very common all over in India. It was also true that the number of literacy was very less in that time. To educate those people in the medieval era, it was also very important that the stories are told through pictures. Then the stories and the morals could actually had possibilities to create larger impact on the human mind and make it more memorable. Deviprasad Ghosh in Bharatiya Shilpa Dhara mentions of Buddhist monk from the 6th century BCE named Mathaliputta Goshala, a well-known philosopher who was the son of Patachitrakar from Nalanda. And in his writing he mentions about the father of Mathaliputta, and that gives us the information that Patachitra was popular in that time also, and one could take it up as a profession, a full-time profession. It was the only identity of that person that he was a Patachitrakar. He made painted scrolls. Patanjali, the author of Yoga Sutra, in his reinterpretation of Panini Sutra, mentions of a painter community named Shobhik, who created scrolls to demonstrate and took it as their profession. Earlier in 4th century BCE, Panini wrote in his book Ashtadhyayi of two distinct groups of painters: village painters, those who paint to cater to the need of rural folks, and the court painters, those who create according to the wish and taste of the king. For more than 2500 years, depending on the collective memory of the sages, the Vedic tradition had been preserved orally. They apprehended that transcribing the content would have detracted them from their sacrosanctity. Certain evidences establish that the grammarians were aware of some form of alphabetical construction. They had demarcated the syntax of the Sanskrit language by the 5th century BCE, but there were no suggestions found of an early script that could be categorized as Sanskrit. In 6th century BCE, the tradition of oral script included the theoretical doctrines and the canonical literature of the two heterodox religious systems, Jainism and Buddhism. Although it is not known whether writing was practiced in Vedic India, the Indus Valley civilization had evidences of the pictographic script about 3000 years old. The traders from Mesopotamia reintroduced writing in the 8th century BCE, but writing did not popularize as an effective medium for recording and transcribing the wide literary heritage. Such omnipresence of the oral literature sustained until about the 4th century BCE. The informations are authenticated from the writings of Saryu Doshi in 1985 in Marg. Written scripts began to get incorporated with the Pali Buddhist canons of 5th century BC, inscribed on leaves, wooden base and metal sheets. Jain and Buddhists, having been lesser orthodox than the Vedic religious groups, had not inherited a colossal and well established vestige of tradition. Jains experienced the disadvantage of memory based oral transmission during a famine that took place in Magadha during the 4th century BCE. It was more like a story that gives us some clue about why was it that they started shifting towards the written scripts, and they reduced the pictorial formations and the images, the use of images to some extent, and slowly the images disappeared from the text. They were only used as illustrations or illumination to complement the writings. It was not that they were depending on it for a very long time because of a story, a fact based story that made them realize, perhaps we can assume that way, that it was during the famine in Magadha during 4th century BC, where a group of Jain monk they had to move to the southern part of India. Now, once they moved, the other group, they stayed back. Some of the saints couldn't move, and group they shifted to southern India. And that way what happened that many of the people who were there in the famine affected areas, they either died of starvation or suffered memory lapses due to malnutrition. And that was very unfortunate that as a result many of the unwritten Jain canons were bewildered and hence lost. To inhibit added disintegration, the Jains formed a council of monks at Pataliputra, present Patna, and began to retrieve the canonical teaching of Jainism with some immediacy. The monks who migrated during the famine to the southern India had returned back to find the newly formed canons as inauthentic and declared themselves as Mula Sangha, means the original council, and broke away from the Digambaras. The contents of the canonical text known as Shastra Bhandara, the treasury of canons, open up a persistent tradition. It contains numerous illustrated documents containing paper and palm leaf manuscripts and patachitras on cloth. Over the centuries, each sect has established centers throughout India. Both illustrated manuscripts traditions serve to supplement and complement one another, and together they have contributed valuable evidence towards determining the historical unfolding of Jain painting in particular, as well as towards the history of Indian miniature painting in general. Quote from Saryu Doshi: "It is often difficult to disassociate myths, legends, and sagas from the facts. Scholarly indications suggest that the miniatures replaced the tradition of painting in the caves. During the middle half of 8th century, Bengal was ruled by the Pal and Sen dynasty. This was after Bharata wrote his Natya Shastra to set the doctrine of aesthetics in classical art forms. During the reign of Pala dynasty in Bengal, codification of canon in all official forms of art came into vogue with the scholarly writings of Vamaha, Anandavardhana, and Abhinavagupta. Pala miniature painting of Bengal is to be counted as analogous to the earlier mentioned Jain miniature tradition. This was amongst the most significant indigenous miniature tradition of India, which is, in spite of being regional and provisional, had found a national eminence due to the scrupulous adherence to the grammar. Folk painters, on the contrary, did not follow the canons and were therefore exorcised from the mainstream practice, followed by a further expel from the Hindu community. We make an assumption that this appellation positively resulted into the formation of a parallel practice that was free from the classical restrictions. The Pattichitra tradition had rather achieved a recluse identity in isolation that was much grounded and thrived as wildflower within common populace. The myths and the facts are so closely connected that it gets very difficult at times to separate the two, and that creates a basic confusion, and that also keeps us interested to its research. So in our next lecture, I am going to tell you certain myths which are popularly known. It's almost spreaded all over in the country. Everybody knows about it. If you go there, interview people, but there are hardly any written resources that are there. Of course, there are certain things which are quite authentic and the texts are still available and it needs proper preservation. But let's see how the myths are connected to the stories and how the whole culture and the tradition of folk and minor art gets more and more life. That is also very grounded, very down to earth and human through those stories which are facts, fantasies, fictions, authenticities, and everything has become almost blended, and that's the basic life of it.